The 7-year-old boy trembled in the rain, clutching his blind 3-legged dog as the train's horn screamed into the night. "Please, don't die," he whispered, lightning tearing the sky apart. Beneath the massive train, a little girl was trapped screaming in terror. In that moment, he knew the only light in this darkness was this crippled dog. Subscribe now to never miss our next hauntingly emotional films. The night bled into itself. Darkness layered upon darkness until it felt like the world had forgotten what light looked like. Rain fell in heavy sheets that blurred the outlines of the town's distant factory chimneys, turned the cracked asphalt of Maple Street into a glistening black mirror, and filled the air with the endless whisper of grief. A solitary figure in black stood by the edge of the railway tracks, the hem of her dress clinging to her calves, soaked and heavy. Olivia Winters didn't notice. Her eyes were locked onto the marble headstone that jutted out from the wet grass like a broken tooth. James R. Winters, beloved husband, loving father, taken too soon. The words etched into stone blurred behind her tears in the rain. She wiped at her face, unable to tell which was which. At her feet, small fingers clutched the folds of her dress. Lucas stood silent, his Mickey Mouse rain boots half submerged in a puddle that trembled each time thunder rolled across the Tennessee hills. In his other hand, he held a faded brown bear by its paw, the fur matted from years of secret tears and whispered dreams. The bear's bead eyes seemed as mournful as his own. Mommy, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic clatter of rain hitting the umbrella. Olivia didn't bother to raise. "Is Daddy still here? Is Dad?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed locked on the headstone, as if looking away might let him slip further beyond reach. "Daddy's always here," she finally said, her voice cracking mid-sentence. She swallowed back the sob that wanted to rip out of her throat. "He's watching over us, baby." Lucas pressed closer to her leg. His small face turned up towards hers, raindrops sliding down his cheeks like tears. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the day of the funeral, when he'd sat perfectly still in the front pew, clutching that same bear, watching men lower his father's coffin into the earth. Some people said he was too young to understand. Olivia knew better. Lucas understood everything. Too much. A gust of wind rushed across the cemetery, rattling the bare limbs of the oak trees lining the fence. The iron gate groaned on its hinges as the storm pushed it open a fraction more. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn wailed, long and mournful like a dying animal calling out for a mate it would never see again. Olivia flinched. Every time she heard that sound, her chest constricted until it felt like her ribs would splinter. She saw the newspaper headlines in her mind again, bold black letters against the white page. Local hero killed in train collision. Father of one dies saving high school students stranded on track. She'd read that headline so many times, the words were branded onto the back of her eyelids. But no number of readings ever numbed the burn. The horn faded into the night, leaving only the rush of rain and the quiet sob of her heart. She knelt down slowly, the wet grass soaking through her dress, and cupped Lucas's face in her cold, trembling hands. His blue eyes blinked at her, impossibly solemn for a 7-year-old. "Do you want to go now?" she asked. He nodded once, but didn't speak. She stood, took his free hand, and together they walked away from the grave, leaving behind the stone that marked the line between before and after in their lives. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, like insects trapped in jars. The smell of wet dog ammonia, disinfectant, and stale kibble filled the air with a pungency that clung to clothes and hair long after you left. Olivia tried to breathe through her mouth as she and Lucas walked down the narrow row of kennels, their shoes squeaking against the damp concrete floor. Dogs barked, whined, growled. Some leaped at the chain-link fences, tongues lolling, eyes bright with frantic hope. Others lay curled in corners, eyes dull and resigned to whatever fate waited at the end of the aisle. "Stay close, Lucas," Olivia said, tugging gently at his hand when he slowed to peer into each cage. "We're just looking today." He didn't respond, didn't even nod. His gaze drifted from kennel to kennel, lingering a heartbeat longer on each dog's eyes before moving on. A black pit bull with ribs like xylophone keys. A shaggy golden retriever missing half its fur. A trembling greyhound with scars etched into its skin like war paint. Then, near the end of the aisle, Lucas stopped so suddenly that Olivia almost stumbled. She followed his gaze into the dim shadows of the last kennel. Curled into the far corner was a black Labrador skeletal under its matted coat. One hind leg was missing from the knee, down ending in a clean stump wrapped in filthy bandages. A milky film clouded both its eyes. The dog's chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths, each one sounding like it scraped against splinters inside its ribs. Flies buzzed around a seeping wound near its shoulder blade. Its ears twitched weakly, but it didn't lift its head to look at them. "Come on, Lucas," Olivia said quickly, tugging at his hand. "Let's keep moving." But he didn't budge. He let go of her fingers and stepped closer to the fence, placing his small palms against the cold metal links. "Mama," he whispered, voice shaking. "What's his name?" She glanced at the kennel door. The rusted metal tag read only no name, male, 8 years, injuries, blind, pending euthanasia. He doesn't have a name," Olivia said softly, her throat tightening. "Come on, sweetheart. He's not going to make it. We should." "He has a name," Lucas interrupted, his voice suddenly fierce, despite the tears gathering in his lashes. "His name is Shadow." "Lucas, he's Shadow, Mama," he said again, louder this time, his eyes never leaving the broken dog huddled in the gloom. "He's Shadow because he sees with his heart. He sees me." Olivia felt her knees weaken. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, shadows jumping across the kennel walls. The rain continued to pound against the corrugated metal roof, filling the shelter with a drumming echo that felt like a countdown. She looked at the dog again. Its eyes were blank, staring at nothing. But as Lucas spoke, one ear twitched. Slowly, painfully, it lifted its head and turned toward the boy. Its nose quivered, its tail thin and bare in places, thumped once against the dirty blanket beneath it. Just once. But it was enough. Lucas pressed his forehead against the fence, his small shoulders shaking as silent sobs racked his chest. "He sees me, Mama," he whispered again, softer now. "Even if he can't see anything else, he sees me." For a long moment, Olivia couldn't breathe. The smell of disinfectant and wet fur faded. The barking dogs blurred into silence. All she could hear was the rain, and in its rhythm, she thought she heard James's voice. "Don't give up on him, Liv. Don't give up on him." Her vision blurred with tears. She blinked them away, wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand, and crouched down beside her son. "Lucas," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of grief and fear and something dangerously close to hope. "Sweetheart, we can't. He's sick. He's old. He's blind. He's going to die soon anyway." Lucas turned to look at her then. His eyes were blue like his father's, fierce like his father's, and filled with a quiet pain too big for a child to carry. In that moment, Olivia saw James kneeling in front of their son on his first day of kindergarten, adjusting the straps of his Spider-Man backpack, kissing his forehead, and whispering, "Be brave, little man. Even when you're scared, be brave." Lucas lifted his chin, tears streaming down his cheeks. "He's not dead yet," he said simply. Outside, the storm thundered, lightning splitting the sky into jagged shards of white. The fluorescent lights flickered again. For a moment, the entire room plunged into darkness before the emergency generator buzzed to life and the lights returned. But in that instant of darkness, Olivia saw it. She saw James standing behind Lucas, one hand resting on their son's small shoulder, the other reaching out toward the trembling dog in the cage. His face was lit by a soft, sad smile. Then the light returned, and he was gone. Olivia exhaled a shaky breath, stood and brushed her soaked hair from her eyes. She looked down at her son, then at the broken dog, who had managed to lift his head to listen to their voices. "Shadow," she whispered. Lucas turned to her, hope sparking in his eyes for the first time in 3 months. "His name is Shadow," she said again, firmer this time. The dog's tail thumped once more against the blanket, a sound so soft it barely rose above the thunder. But to Lucas, it was deafening. He turned back to Shadow and pressed his small hand against the cage. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice trembling with tears and unbreakable conviction. "I see you too." The drive home was silent, except for the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers fighting back the relentless rain. Each stroke carved out a brief window of clarity through which the blurred world flickered past. Telephone poles, sagging mailboxes, yards strewn with children's toys half buried in the mud. A town that always seemed just a little tired, like it had spent too many decades fighting to keep its head above water. Lucas sat in the back seatbelt, snug across his chest, his head turned sideways to watch the crate beside him. Inside, Shadow lay on a thin towel that Olivia had hastily spread out, his breathing ragged but steady. Every few seconds, his stump twitched involuntarily, causing his thin body to shift against the hard plastic floor. His eyes were open, milky and unseeing, but they flicked toward Lucas each time the boy spoke. "It's okay," Shadow Lucas whispered, his fingers curling through the metal grate of the crate door. "You're coming home now. You're safe." From the driver's seat, Olivia watched them through the rearview mirror. The boy's whispering comfort, the dog's barely perceptible tail thump. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles blanched white. Her chest felt too small, as if her ribs were pressing inward with every breath. A horn blared behind them, snapping her focus back to the road. The light had turned green. She pressed the gas, her eyes flicking nervously from the mirror to the cracked asphalt ahead. The rain showed no signs of stopping. When they pulled into the cracked driveway of their small tan house on Maple Street, the storm had lessened into a drizzle that fell in fine needling drops. Olivia parked under the carport and turned off the engine. For a moment, no one moved. The ticking of the cooling engine and the soft patter of rain on the aluminum roof filled the silence. Mommy Lucas said, breaking the quiet. "Can I carry him inside?" Olivia turned to look at him. His blue eyes were wide with hope and something she recognized as responsibility. He wasn't just a little boy bringing home a puppy. He was a child who believed he had saved a life. And she realized in that moment that maybe he had. "No, baby," she said softly. "He's too heavy for you. Let me do it." She stepped out into the drizzle, the cold dampness immediately soaking into her cardigan. Opening the sliding door of the minivan, she crouched to lift the crate. It was lighter than she expected. Too light. Shadow's frailness hit her with physical force. She could feel every bone through the towel as she shifted the crate against her chest. Lucas hurried ahead to unlock the front door, pushing it open with a creak that echoed in the silent house. Olivia carried the crate inside and set it down in the living room, near the old floral couch that sagged in the middle. Shadow lay completely still, his eyes flicking blindly around the unfamiliar space, ears twitching at the new smells and sounds. His body trembled slightly, a vibration that ran from his shoulders to the tip of his thin tail. "See, Shadow," Lucas said, kneeling beside the crate and unlocking the latch. "This is your home now." He pulled the door open. Shadow didn't move. Lucas crawled forward on his knees until his face was inches from Shadow's. He reached out a tentative hand and rested it gently on the dog's forehead. Shadow flinched at first, then went still under the boy's touch. His ears flattened against his skull, his breathing slow and labored. "It's okay," Lucas whispered, voice trembling. "I see you." Olivia turned away, blinking rapidly. Her eyes drifted around the living room. The stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table, the laundry basket overflowing in the corner, the photo of James on the mantel smiling out at her with that infuriating optimism she both loved and hated. She felt a scream building in her throat. She swallowed it back down. A sudden movement outside the window caught her eye. Curtains twitched across the street. Porch lights flicked on, despite the mid-afternoon gloom. The neighborhood grapevine was already humming with curiosity. And as if summoned by the unspoken chatter, the front door opened and a cold draft swept into the room. Olivia turned sharply. There stood Mrs. Jenkins from 2 houses down, clutching her umbrella like a spear. Her permed gray hair curled damply around her wrinkled face, lips pursed in permanent judgment. "Well, I'll be," she said, her voice dripping disdain. "That what y'all brought home, that thing?" Olivia stiffened. "Hello, Patricia," she said tightly. "This is Shadow. We adopted him today." Mrs. Jenkins sniffed her sharp eyes, flicking from Shadow's trembling form to Lucas, who sat protectively in front of him. "Looks half dead to me," she scoffed. "Poor boy bringing home a fey Thai dog like that. He'll break his heart all over again when it dies on him next week." "Please leave, Patricia," Olivia said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, her mouth curling in a smirk. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you. Boy needs stability, not pity projects." She turned and left her perfume lingering behind, like stale roses. Lucas didn't look up. He just kept stroking Shadow's ears, whispering softly. Olivia closed the door with shaking hands. Outside, she could hear another voice from across the street. "Did you see what Olivia brought home?" "Yeah. Thang bay ku tu cha fei tai." Pitiful. The words cut deeper than she expected. She pressed her forehead against the door, her shoulders trembling. "God, James. I don't know if I can do this alone." That evening, as darkness fell over Maple Street, Olivia set out a shallow bowl of water and half a can of soft dog food on a paper plate. Shadow didn't move. He lay curled on the old blanket Lucas had spread for him, eyes closed, breathing slow and unsteady. "Maybe he's too tired to eat tonight," Lucas said, his voice small but hopeful. "He can eat tomorrow, right, Mama?" "Yeah," Olivia whispered. "Tomorrow." They ate dinner in silence. Canned soup, saltines. Lucas crumbled crackers into his bowl, humming quietly under his breath. Olivia couldn't bring herself to eat more than a few spoonfuls. Her stomach felt like a fist clenched tight. After dishes were washed and Lucas brushed his teeth, she tucked him into bed. He clutched his bear to his chest, staring up at her with solemn eyes. "Will Shadow be okay tonight?" he asked. "I hope so," she said honestly. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her fingers lingering on his warm skin. "Go to sleep, baby. I'll check on him. But sleep did not come easily that night, for either of them. Olivia sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. Outside, rain had begun falling again, a slow, steady drizzle that darkened the streets and turned the puddles into silent black mirrors. The house felt too big, too empty, every creak of the floorboards echoing like footsteps in the dark. And from the corner of the room, she heard it. Soft at first. A quiet whimper that rose into a low, keening wail. Shadow. The sound sliced through her like a blade. She closed her eyes, pressing her hands against her ears, but it seeped into her bones. She saw James. Saw him lying still on the metal gurney at the hospital, hair plastered to his forehead, with blood and rainwater skin already pale with the creeping chill of death. She saw the doctor shaking his head, saw the body bag being zipped up. He had looked so small then, her strong, laughing James, reduced to a husk. Shadow's whimper turned into a high-pitched whine, desperate and unending. Olivia stood abruptly, her legs trembling, and walked across the room to where he lay. His body was curled tight, head tucked under his chest, whole frame shaking with pain or fear. She couldn't tell which. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice sharp with exhaustion and grief. "Please, just stop." But Shadow didn't stop. His chest heaved with each broken whine, his front paws scrabbling weakly against the blanket as if searching for something in the dark. Olivia knelt down beside him, the tears spilling over at last. She reached out a shaking hand and touched his head. His ears flicked at her touch. His whine softened to a low moan, vibrating in his chest like a sob. "Please," she whispered again, her tears dripping onto his thin fur. "Please don't die tonight. I can't take another death in this house." Shadow's breathing hitched. For a moment his tail twitched once against the blanket, and he shifted his head toward her. His milky eyes blinked open, unfocused, staring through her into the dark beyond. But Olivia felt it. That he knew she was there. That he heard her. She rested her forehead against his, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Somewhere far away, a train horn wailed in the night. And in the dark living room of their battered little house, Olivia Winters cried into the thin, ragged fur of a broken dog her son called Shadow, wondering if there was any light left in a world that had taken so much from them both. Lucas woke to darkness. Not the warm darkness of sleep where dreams still curled and breathed against the walls of his mind, but the kind of darkness that felt alive. A thick, heavy thing, pressing down from every direction, filling the tiny spaces between his ribs, settling like cold water in the hollow of his chest. The nightlight, shaped like a sleepy moon, glowed faintly in the corner of his room, casting a weak yellow halo across the carpet strewn with Legos and picture books. But its glow didn't reach the bed where Lucas lay, curled against Shadow's thin, trembling body. Shadow's breathing was shallow, each exhale rattling softly in his chest. His stump twitched in his sleep, and a low whimper vibrated in his throat. Lucas shifted closer, pulling the old fleece blanket tighter around them both. The dog smelled of medicine-damp fur and something metallic that made the back of Lucas's throat taste bitter. But he didn't mind. Shadow was warm and Lucas needed warm. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. In its place came a restless hush. The quiet after the storm. A quiet that felt too big for the small house wrapping around it, like the hush that falls in church when everyone bows their heads to pray. Lucas closed his eyes and pressed his face into Shadow's neck, feeling the rapid thrum of the dog's heart beneath thin skin. He whispered so softly even he could barely hear it. "It's okay, Shadow. I see you." Then sleep took him again. He was standing on the train tracks, not standing, floating somehow. The old wooden ties stretched out in both directions, disappearing into a fog that pulsed with dim white light like breathing. Beneath his feet, the metal rails gleamed wet and cold. He felt no weight, no fear, just a quiet knowing that he was supposed to be here. Ahead of him, a figure emerged from the fog. Tall, broad shoulders. The shape was so familiar, it made Lucas's chest ache before his mind even finished naming it. "Daddy?" The man walked toward him, boots echoing softly against the steel rails. As he stepped into the clear, Lucas saw that he was smiling, that small, crooked smile that always appeared when Daddy tried not to laugh at something silly. His hair was tousled by a breeze that didn't exist. His eyes were tired, but kind. And he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Shadow, but not the Shadow Lucas knew. This shadow was strong, healthy. His coat was sleek and black as midnight. All four legs carried him with fluid grace muscles rippling beneath his fur as he trotted proudly next to Daddy, his pink tongue lolling out in a happy dog smile. Lucas's eyes widened. His heart soared and he dropped to his knees on the tracks, arms outstretched as Shadow bounded toward him, ears flopping with each stride. He laughed as the dog knocked him backward, licking his face with warm, wet kisses that smelled like sunshine and wild grass. Shadow, Lucas squealed. "You can see me." Shadow wagged his tail so hard, his whole body wiggled with it. His eyes were clear, deep brown pools filled with light. They looked right into Lucas's, and Lucas felt something inside his chest uncoil. A tightness he hadn't known was there until it loosened. A hand rested on his shoulder. Lucas turned his head and saw Daddy kneeling beside him, smile soft and sad. "You found him," Daddy said. Lucas nodded, tears filling his eyes. "He was so sad, Daddy. Nobody wanted him." Daddy's smile flickered like the moon behind fast-moving clouds. He looked down at Shadow, who was panting happily between them, then back at Lucas. "That's because they couldn't see what you see," Daddy said. "But you could. You always could." Lucas pressed his face against Daddy's chest, breathing in the smell of sawdust laundry soap and the faint trace of peppermint gum Daddy always chewed when he was working late. For a moment, everything felt right. Like time had folded in on itself and brought back the before. "Don't go, Daddy," he whispered. "Please, stay with me. Stay with us." Daddy's arms tightened around him. Lucas felt the rumble of his voice against his ear as he spoke. "I can't, little man," he said softly. "But Shadow? Shadow can." Lucas pulled back just enough to look into his father's eyes. They were sad. But there was something else there too. Something bright. "He needs you," Daddy continued. "And you need him. Take care of him for me, okay?" Lucas nodded, choking on tears that felt too big for his small chest. "I promise." Daddy smiled again, and he reached out to ruffle Shadow's ears. The dog leaned into the touch-tail, wagging in slow, grateful sweeps. "Good boy," Daddy murmured. A low rumble began to grow in the fog around them. Lucas turned his head and saw a light, blinding white cutting through the darkness, growing larger and larger. The ground trembled beneath his knees. Shadow whined and pressed closer to him. Daddy stood eyes fixed on the oncoming train. "It's time to go, buddy," he said, reaching down to squeeze Lucas's hand. "No," Lucas cried, clutching at his father's fingers. "No, don't go. Don't leave me again." But Daddy was already fading. The light swallowed everything. The fog burned away into brilliant white. The rails vibrated with impossible force. The roar of the train drowned out Lucas's scream. And then, silence. Lucas jerked awake with a sharp gasp. His heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. His pajamas were damp with sweat, his cheeks wet with tears. Beside him, Shadow stirred, lifting his head to sniff the air blindly. He whined softly and shifted closer, pressing his thin body against Lucas's chest. The boy buried his face in the dog's fur, sobs, shaking his small frame. "Bah!" He whispered the Vietnamese word for father, slipping out before he could catch it. He hadn't called Daddy that since he was a toddler when Olivia still sang him lullabies in 2 languages. "Bah, we concana." Daddy knew I needed him. Shadow's breathing was slow and steady. The rhythmic rise and fall of his ribs under Lucas's cheek soothed the boy's ragged breaths. The dog whined again, his tail giving a single weak thump against the mattress. Lucas pressed a trembling hand to Shadow's chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath brittle ribs. "I see you," he whispered, tears dripping onto the matted fur. "I see you, Shadow." Outside the window, dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, painting the world in pale streaks of gray and lavender. Birds began to sing tentative notes into the waking quiet, each chirp an act of faith that light would return. Lucas closed his eyes and listened to the birds, his tears soaking into Shadow's fur. He imagined Daddy walking with them down the railroad tracks, Shadow strong and proud by his side. He imagined the fog burning away to reveal sunshine, warm, bright, alive. And for the first time since the day Daddy died, Lucas fell back asleep with hope curled up warm beside him. Morning came slow and cold, gray light creeping through the thin blinds of Lucas's bedroom like reluctant hope. Olivia hadn't slept. She sat hunched at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling untouched between her hands. Bills lay spread before her final notices, printed in thick red letters that screamed louder than any human voice ever could. The world felt hushed, as if the storm that had passed left behind a stillness too heavy to lift. She closed her eyes and tried to remember James's voice telling her that things would work out, that she was strong enough that they could weather anything together. But the only voice she heard was her own breathing, ragged with exhaustion and grief. From down the hall came a soft whimper, then silence, then a quiet scratching sound like fingernails raking wood. Olivia stood, every muscle aching from a night spent curled in a half-sleeping vigil on the couch. She walked barefoot across the cold linoleum, following the sound to Lucas's room. The door creaked open. Shadow lay on the blanket at the foot of Lucas's bed, paws twitching against the floor as he scratched aimlessly. His milky eyes were open, staring into nothing. Lucas was still asleep, curled into a tight ball beside him, one small hand resting on the dog's bony side. "Shadow," Olivia whispered. The dog's ears twitched. He stilled, nose lifting to scent her presence. His tail thumped once against the blanket, weak but certain. She felt something tighten in her chest, something that might have been hope, but she crushed it down before it could spread. She turned away and went back to the kitchen, forcing herself to swallow 2 mouthfuls of coffee that tasted like burnt rain. The clock above the sink ticked on marking time in mocking precision. Tick, tick, tick. Another hour without James. Another hour closer to rent being due. Outside, the street slowly woke. Car engines coughed to life. Children shrieked as they chased each other to the bus stop. Dogs barked from fenced yards. Life, indifferent and relentless, moved forward without them. Then at exactly 7:23 a.m. it came. The low rumble, at first vibrating up through the damp soil, rattling the silverware and the drying rack. Then the whistle, long, rising, mournful. The sound tore through the quiet morning, vibrating through Olivia's bones with a scream she felt in her teeth. Before her mind could even form the thought, the noise inside the house exploded. Shadow erupted into violent barking, a sound so raw it bordered on screaming. His voice cracked with desperation, howls tearing from his chest in a frenzy of terror. The scratching turned into frantic clawing against the hardwood floor. Thud, thud, thud. His claws scraped splinters from the doorframe as he lunged toward the hallway, slipping and stumbling, but never stopping. "Shadow," Olivia shouted, dropping her mug. It shattered on the linoleum, coffee splattering her bare feet like cold mud. "Shadow, stop! Stop it!" But the dog couldn't hear her. He crashed into the door, rebounded, and threw himself against it again, barking so loud that Lucas woke with a terrified cry. Olivia ran down the hall, nearly slipping and spilled coffee hearts slamming against her ribs. Shadow was at the front door now, his body trembling so violently she thought his bones might snap under the strain. He leapt up against the doorknob, clawing at the wood until his nails tore thin grooves into the paint. His eyes, blank and unseeing, were wide with horror. Foam dripped from his jowls as his barking turned hoarse. "Shadow," Lucas cried, stumbling from his room in Superman pajamas, hair sticking up wildly. "Shadow." It's okay. But Shadow didn't stop. His tail was tucked so far between his legs, it touched his stomach. His paws bled where his claws had splintered. The whistle wailed again, closer now as the train passed through town, shaking the house with its passing. Shadow threw himself against the door so hard it rattled on its hinges. Olivia grabbed him by the scruff, trying to pull him back. He twisted in her grip, wild with fear, his claws scraping her wrist. She cried out, but didn't let go. Lucas wrapped his arms around Shadow's neck, tears streaming down his face. "It's okay, Shadow," he sobbed. "Please, it's okay." And just like that, it stopped. The whistle faded into the distance. The ground stilled. The only sound left was Shadow's ragged panting and Lucas's quiet sobs. The dog collapsed onto the floor legs, splayed awkwardly, chest heaving with each shallow breath. His eyes rolled back for a moment before fluttering closed. Olivia sank to her knees beside him, clutching her scraped wrist to her chest. Her heart was pounding so hard, she felt dizzy. Across the street, she saw curtains twitch, faces pressed against windows. Whispers rose like steam into the cold morning air. "Crazy dog. That woman's lost it. She needs to put that thing down." Their words filtered through the glass, muffled but sharp as glass shards. Olivia reached out and placed a shaking hand on Shadow's side. His ribs flinched under her touch. He whined softly, but didn't move away. Lucas pressed his face into the dog's fur shoulders, shaking with silent tears. He was trying to tell us something," Lucas whispered. "Tell us what." Olivia snapped, harsher than she intended. The adrenaline still burned in her veins, a bitter taste in the back of her throat. "That he's crazy, that he's dangerous." Lucas flinched, pulling back just enough to look at her. His eyes were red tears clinging to his lashes like tiny diamonds. "No," he whispered. "He's scared." Olivia pressed her trembling fingers against her temples. A headache pounded behind her eyes. The image of Shadow throwing himself at the door burned in her mind. His foam-flecked mouth, his bleeding paws, the animal desperation in his voice. "This can't happen," every time she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. We can't do this." Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but shut it again when he saw her expression. Shadow let out a low, mournful whine that vibrated through the floorboards and up into Olivia's bones. She stood abruptly and walked to the kitchen, stepping over shards of ceramic, her bare feet crunching against broken edges. She didn't care. She yanked her phone off the counter and scrolled to the animal shelter's number. Mommy Lucas's voice was small and shaking behind her. She didn't answer. Her thumb hovered over the call button, terrors blurring the screen. Outside, the world moved on. A car door slammed. Children laughed. A dog barked 2 houses down. She pressed the phone to her ear. "Riverdale, Animal Rescue. How can I help you?" Her voice came out as a rasp. "This is Olivia Winters. I adopted a dog from you yesterday." "Shadow, the black lab. Blind 3 legs." "Yes, ma'am," the woman on the line said cautiously. "Is everything okay?" Olivia closed her eyes. She saw James's face in her mind, smiling at her across the dinner table, laughing as he tossed Lucas into the air. His eyes crinkled with happiness and love. Eyes that would never open again. "No," she whispered. "It's not okay." Shadow whimpered softly in the living room, as if sensing her words. Lucas clutched him tighter, burying his face in the dog's neck. I can't keep him," Olivia said. The words ripped out of her, leaving behind an ache so deep it felt bottomless. "I'm sorry. I can't." "Ma'am, I'll bring him back this afternoon," she said, her voice numb. "Please. I'm sorry." She hung up before the woman could respond. Her hand fell to her side phone, dangling loosely between her fingers. From the living room came the sound of Lucas's quiet crying. Shadow let out another low whine, softer this time. Resigned. Olivia pressed her palm against her mouth to keep from screaming. Outside, the train whistle wailed again, far away, now echoing across the sleeping hills like a ghost calling for the living. And in that small, dim kitchen surrounded by bills, she couldn't pay broken mugs, she couldn't replace, and memories she couldn't bury Olivia. Winters felt the weight of her own helplessness crush what little hope she had left. The morning passed like a silent funeral procession. The house felt different, heavier, as if its walls had absorbed the echoes of Shadow's frantic barking and now refused to release them. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, pressing down on Maple Street with a suffocating stillness. Shadow lay curled against the living room wall, his thin body trembling in tiny involuntary shivers. His milky eyes were half-lidded, staring blankly at the scuffed baseboards. Each breath came out as a ragged wheeze, his ribs rising and falling so sharply that they seemed about to pierce his thin, battered skin. Beside him sat Lucas, his small frame hunched in defeat. The plastic bowl of softened dog food sat untouched between them. Flies buzzed around it lazily. The smell of chicken and gravy filled the stale room, making Olivia gag when she walked by. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "Baby, you need to eat something." He didn't look up. His hand rested on Shadow's head, stroking behind his ears with slow, rhythmic motions. The dog didn't respond, didn't flick his tail, didn't twitch his nose at the smell of food. Just lay there breathing slow and shallow, like each inhale might be his last. "Please, Lucas," whispered, his voice so soft Olivia barely heard it. "Please, Shadow. Eat something. You gotta eat." The dog let out a low, shuddering sigh and turned his head away from the bowl. His eyelids fluttered closed. The trembling in his shoulders stilled into an unnatural stillness that made panic rise in Olivia's throat. "Lucas," she said again, sharper this time. "Come away from him for a bit. Let him rest." "No." Lucas snapped his head, jerking up to glare at her. Tears clung to his lashes, his cheeks blotchy and red. "No. He can't rest. If he rests, if he sleeps too long." His voice broke. A sob tore out of him, sudden and violent. He doubled over, pressing his forehead into Shadow's thin side, his small shoulders shaking with grief, too big for his little body to hold. "Please don't leave me," he cried, words muffled against the dog's fur. "Please, Shadow. Please don't go. You're my shadow. My shadow." Olivia stood frozen in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth to keep from screaming. The sight of her son, her sweet, brave boy who hadn't cried like this even at his father's funeral, cracked something inside her that she'd been holding together with spit and stubbornness since the day James died. She turned away, stumbling into the kitchen, her vision blurring with hot tears. She gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles went white. The cheap laminate felt sharp under her fingertips, grounding her in its small, ugly reality. "I can't do this. I can't watch him lose something else. I can't watch him break again. A noise behind her made her spin around. The hallway mirror caught her reflection as she moved. Her hair was tangled, skin pale and blotchy eyes wild with grief. But that wasn't what made her breath catch in her throat. For just a moment, a flicker, a heartbeat less than the blink of an eye, she saw James. He stood behind Lucas in the living room, one broad hand resting on their son's small shoulder, the other reaching out to shadow fingers brushing the dog's trembling head. His eyes were sad but calm, filled with that same quiet certainty he always had when he told her everything would be okay, even when the world burned around them. Then he was gone. The mirror showed only Lucas curled like a wounded animal beside Shadow's unmoving body. The house felt too quiet again, the silence roaring in Olivia's ears. She pressed a fist against her chest, her heart beating so hard it hurt. The tears spilled over hot and endless, dripping off her chin onto the cracked linoleum. "God," she whispered, her voice shaking with anger and fear and a grief too deep for words. "God, please, please don't take this from him too." She didn't believe anyone was listening. She hadn't believed since the night the state troopers knocked on her door with their hats in their hands and pity in their eyes. But still she whispered the prayer, because hope was the last currency she had, and her boy needed her to spend every last cent. The day dragged by in a gray haze. Olivia called the shelter twice, her thumb hovering over the call button for long minutes before pressing it. Each time she hung up before anyone could answer. The thought of bringing Shadow back felt like dropping Lucas off a cliff with her own hands. But the thought of watching the dog die in their living room felt worse. Around noon, Lucas tried again to feed him. He scooped a small amount of soft food onto his fingers and pressed it gently against Shadow's cracked lips. "Please," he whispered, tears streaking down his cheeks. "Please, Shadow. For me. Please." Shadow shivered under his touch. His nose twitched once, twice. Then he turned his head away, letting out a weak, breathy whine that made Lucas's sob break into a quiet wail. Olivia stood in the doorway, her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails digging crescents into her palms. Every instinct screamed at her to fix this, to make it better, to save him. But she didn't know how. She didn't know how to save anyone anymore. As dusk fell, the sky turned the color of bruises. The living room was dark, except for the flickering light of the old lamp on the side table. Its shade was cracked, casting crooked shadows across the walls. Shadow hadn't moved in hours. His breathing was shallow, chest rising only slightly with each wheezing inhale. Lucas lay curled beside him, his arm draped protectively over the dog's thin body. His eyes were closed, face pressed into Shadow's side lips, moving in silent prayer. "Please don't leave me. Please don't leave me." His words were so quiet, Olivia couldn't hear them from where she stood. But she saw the shape of them, saw the desperation in the way his small body shook with silent sobs, saw the way his fingers clenched in Shadow's matted fur, as if he could anchor the dog to life with sheer will alone. She leaned against the doorframe, her knees trembling. The house was silent, except for Shadow's ragged breathing and Lucas's quiet, hitching sobs. And in that silence, she heard James's voice in her memory. "You're stronger than you think, Liv. Stronger than you'll ever know." She pressed her hand against her mouth, biting back a sob. The grief burned hot in her chest, a wildfire that threatened to consume her. But beneath it, in the ashes, something glowed faintly. Something small and stubborn. Hope. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the worn carpet. Kneeling beside Lucas, she reached out and rested her hand on his back. He flinched at her touch, then relaxed, pressing closer to Shadow. "He's so cold," Mama Lucas whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "He's so cold." Olivia swallowed the lump in her throat. She reached out and rested her hand on Shadow's head. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. His ears twitched once, a tiny flicker of life. "We'll get him warm," she said softly. "We'll get him warm, and tomorrow we'll call Dr. Thompson." Lucas didn't respond. He just pressed his face deeper into Shadow's side, his tears soaking the dog's fur. "Please don't leave me," he whispered again. "Please, Shadow. Please. You're my shadow. My shadow." Outside, the first stars began to appear in the bruised, dusty, cold, and distant. The world turned slowly on its axis, indifferent to the small heartbreak unfolding in a dim living room on Maple Street. And as Olivia sat there watching her son cry himself to sleep beside a dying dog, she felt James beside her again, felt his warmth, heard his voice soft and sure whispering against her ear. "Don't give up on him, Liv. Don't give up." The tears slipped down her cheeks in silent rivers. She bent forward and pressed her forehead against Lucas's back, her other hand resting on Shadow's side. "I won't," she whispered. "I won't." The lamp flickered once, then held steady, casting its crooked shadows across the sleeping boy and the dying dog, the broken mother and the memory of a man who had once been their son. And in that dim light, the world felt a little less dark. The rain came suddenly the way it often did in late summer. One moment the world was lit with that strange golden light that always felt like a promise, and the next it darkened into a bruised twilight clouds, rolling in with thunder rumbling deep in their bellies. Olivia stood by the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the wind, lashing the dying hydrangeas against the siding. She felt the storm building in her bones before she heard it, a low ache deep in her shoulders and the back of her neck. James used to call her his little barometer. You always know before the Weather Channel he'd tease kissing the tip of her nose as she wrinkled it at him. The memory made her chest tighten. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms against the cool edge of the sink, grounding herself in the rough porcelain. From the living room came the quiet buzz of cartoons. Lucas sat cross-legged on the carpet, his knees drawn up to his chest, staring blankly at the television screen. Shadow lay beside him, curled tight, his head resting on the boy's ankle. His breathing was thin and raspy, the rise and fall of his ribs almost imperceptible. The storm broke with a crack of thunder so loud it rattled the window glass. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Rain hammered the roof in thick, heavy sheets. And then, as if struck by lightning himself, Shadow's head snapped up. His milky eyes went wide. His ears twitched forward, trembling with an intensity Olivia hadn't seen in days. His body's stiffened muscles quivering beneath the thin skin. A low whine built in his chest, vibrating against the silence that followed the thunder. Lucas turned, startled. Shadow? Before he could move, Shadow let out a deep, mournful howl. It ripped through the house with such primal force that Olivia flinched, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. Shadow, Lucas shouted, scrambling to his knees. But the dog didn't hear him. He was already moving, faster than Olivia thought possible for his frail body. He lunged toward the front door claws, scrabbling against the wood as he began to bark. A hoarse, ragged barking that was half scream, half sob. The sound reverberated through the living room, rattling the framed photos on the wall. Shadow, stop! Olivia shouted, dropping the dish towel she'd been clutching. Shadow turned in frantic circles, barking, whining, clawing at the door with his single front paw. His stump thudded against the wood uselessly, sending vibrations up his shoulder that made his entire body shake. Mommy, what's wrong with him? Lucas cried, his voice high and thin with panic. Before Olivia could answer, Shadow reared up on his hind legs, pressed his chest against the door, and let out another long, piercing howl. The sound rose above the pounding rain and the distant rumble of thunder echoing down Maple Street like a siren. Then, with a final frantic bark, he dropped to all fours and began ramming his shoulder against the door. Shadow, no, Olivia screamed, running forward, but it was too late. The old latch rusted and Luce gave way under his weight. The door swung open with a loud crack, slamming against the side table so hard the lamp toppled to the ground, shattering into pieces. Cold wind and rain gusted into the living room, carrying with it the smell of wet asphalt and ozone. Shadow bolted out into the storm, his black coat almost invisible against the darkening yard. Shadow, Lucas shrieked. He didn't hesitate. He ran after the dog, bare feet slapping against the wet tile, then pounding onto the cold, rain-slick porch. Lucas! Olivia screamed, her voice ripping out of her with a force that burned her throat. Lucas! She sprinted to the door, her socks slipping on the slick floor. She tore them off with shaking hands and ran outside, the freezing rain instantly plastering her hair to her face. The yard was a blur of shadows and water tree branches whipping wildly in the wind. Lucas! She screamed again, her voice cracking. She saw him then. A small, stumbling figure in Superman pajamas, running barefoot through puddles that splashed up to his knees. Ahead of him, Shadow limped as fast as his 3 legs could carry him, his body silhouetted in the lightning that flashed across the sky. His head was lowered, ears pinned back, but he didn't slow down. Shadow, wait! Lucas cried, his voice ragged with tears and rain. Lucas! Stop! Olivia shouted, but the wind snatched her words and flung them into the storm. She ran after them, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her chest burning with cold air and terror. The ground was slick beneath her feet, mud sucking at her heels as she stumbled across the yard through the broken gate out onto the rain-drenched street. Thunder boomed overhead, rattling her teeth. Streetlights flickered in the wind, casting sickly yellow pools of light onto the pavement. Lucas, she screamed again. She saw him slip and fall, his thin arms scraping against the rough asphalt. He let out a sharp cry, but before Olivia could reach him, he scrambled to his feet, ignoring the blood dripping down his forearm. His eyes were locked on Shadow's dark shape, still limping determinedly down the street toward the railroad tracks that cut through the edge of town. Shadow, come back. Lucas sobbed, his voice cracking. But Shadow didn't stop. His nails clicked against the pavement, his stump dragging awkwardly behind him, but his pace never faltered. His head swung side to side, ears perked forward, nose lifted into the storm, as if he were following a scent only he could sense. Olivia caught up to Lucas and grabbed him by the arm, spinning him around to face her. "Lucas, stop! You can't run off like that," she shouted, her voice shaking with panic and rain. "He's going to the tracks, Mommy." Lucas sobbed, his eyes wide with terror. "He's going to the tracks." Olivia froze, her heart seizing in her chest. Another crack of thunder split the sky, illuminating the distant crossing, where the warning lights flashed red through the downpour. The faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the storm, low and mournful. "Oh God," she whispered, tightening her grip on Lucas's arm. "Oh God, no." Shadow reached the edge of the crossing, his body silhouetted in the flashing red lights. He turned in frantic circles, barking wildly, his voice hoarse with desperation. His tail was tucked so far between his legs, it almost touched his chest. Each bark ended in a whimper, but he kept going, kept howling into the storm as if calling out to something only he could hear. Shadow Lucas screamed, wrenching himself free from Olivia's grip. Before she could grab him, he bolted forward, his small feet splashing through ankle-deep puddles, mud and water streaking up his pale legs. Olivia ran after him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. "Lucas, stop!" she screamed, her voice ragged with terror. Shadow turned toward them as they reached the tracks, his body trembling violently. He let out another bark, sharp and desperate, then turned back toward the train that was approaching in the distance, its headlights cutting twin beams through the falling rain. "Shadow, get off the tracks!" Olivia screamed, but Shadow didn't move. He barked again, then reared up onto his hind legs, his front paws slashing at the air in frantic urgency. He dropped down and turned in a tight circle, barking furiously at something beneath the crossing arm that had lowered its red lights, flashing in the downpour. Olivia's eyes widened as she followed his gaze. There, wedged between the heavy metal rail and the muddy embankment, was a small shape. A girl, no more than 3 or 4 years old. She wore a pink raincoat soaked dark with water, her black hair plastered to her round cheeks. She sobbed quietly, her tiny hands gripping the slick metal rail as she struggled to pull her foot free from where it was wedged between the rail and a chunk of broken asphalt. Mommy, Lucas screamed, pointing. "It's a baby! It's a baby!" The train whistle blared again, louder this time, closer. Olivia's pulse roared in her ears. Without thinking, she shoved Lucas backward into the wet grass. "Stay there," she shouted. She bolted forward, her bare feet slipping on the soaked gravel. Shadow barked wildly, backing up just enough to let Olivia drop to her knees beside the girl. The child screamed as Olivia grabbed her shoulders. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," Olivia panted, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grip the slick rubber of the girl's boot. "I've got you. I've got you." Shadow darted forward, pressing his nose against the girl's cheek, whining low and urgent. The train's horn roared again, so close now that Olivia felt its vibration in her teeth. Come on," she whispered, yanking at the boot. The girl screamed as her foot twisted, but Olivia didn't stop. The rails beneath them began to tremble with the oncoming weight. The train's headlights blazed through the rain, reflecting off Shadow's wet fur, turning him into a glowing specter in the storm. With a final wrench, the boot came free. Olivia scooped the child into her arms and stumbled backward off the tracks, her knees buckling in the mud. Shadow backed away with them, barking wildly at the train as it thundered past wind and water lashing them in its wake. The girl sobbed against Olivia's chest, clinging to her neck with tiny fists. Shadow collapsed beside them, his chest heaving with exhausted, ragged breaths. Lucas ran forward, tears streaming down his face, and threw his arms around Shadow's wet neck. "You're okay," he sobbed. "You're okay. You're my Shadow, my brave Shadow." Olivia pressed her face into the girl's damp hair, her tears mingling with the rain. And for the first time in months, she felt something bloom in her chest. Small, fragile, but alive. Hope. The rain fell in relentless sheets, a gray curtain that swallowed the world. Wind whipped it sideways, slamming it against Olivia's face so hard it stung her skin. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks, soaked and heavy. Each breath burned with cold air and panic. Shadow ran ahead, his black shape nearly invisible against the storm-darkened road. His 3 legs moved with surprising speed, his chest heaving his head, swinging side to side as if tracking a scent only he could smell. Shadow Lucas shouted from behind her, his voice ragged with fear. He stumbled in the mud, his thin arms flailing as he tried to keep up. Olivia grabbed his wrist and pulled him along, forcing her legs to move faster, despite the ache screaming through her calves. "Stay close to me, baby," she gasped, her lungs burning. "Stay close." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in stark white for a single frozen moment. In that flash, Olivia saw Shadow leap over a fallen branch, his stump dragging awkwardly, but never slowing him down. Beyond him, through the sheets of rain, she saw the faint red glow of the railroad crossing lights. A sound rose in the distance, low and vibrating. The train whistle, mournful, approaching. No, Olivia whispered, tightening her grip on Lucas's wrist until he cried out. No, God, please. Shadow let out a sharp, urgent bark and veered left, sprinting through knee-deep water, pooling in the drainage ditch that paralleled the tracks. Olivia and Lucas splashed after him, water soaking their pants, turning them heavy and cold against their skin. The train whistle blared again, closer now. Lucas's feet slipped on the slick gravel lining the edge of the ditch. He fell to his knees with a sharp cry, muddy water splashing up into his face. Get up, Olivia screamed, yanking him to his feet. Get up, Lucas, please. Shadow barked again, high and panicked. Olivia looked up and saw it. The train was stopped dead on the tracks, steam rising from its engine in great hissing clouds. Its emergency lights flashed red against the sheets of rain. And there, beneath the third car from the engine, she saw a small figure, a little girl, maybe 3 years old. She wore a pink raincoat soaked dark with water, her black hair plastered to her chubby cheeks. Her tiny hands clutched at the metal coupler above her head as she struggled against the rushing water swirling around her knees. The flood from the storm had breached the drainage ditches, pooling across the low-lying tracks. She was trapped. Shadow lunged forward, barking wildly, his paws splashing through the rising water as he tried to reach her. His stump dragged behind him, sending up small wakes as he moved. He reached the edge of the car and reared up on his hind legs, slashing his front paw against the steel coupler, barking so loud it echoed off the train cars and into the screaming wind. Shadow, Lucas cried, his voice breaking with desperation. Kuko 80, Shadow. Olivia's heart seized in her chest. She grabbed Lucas's shoulders and held him tight, her entire body trembling with fear and adrenaline. Stay here, she said, her voice trembling so hard she wasn't sure he could understand her. Do not move. Do you hear me? Do not move. Mommy, no. Lucas sobbed, clutching her soaked shirt. Don't leave me. I'm not leaving you, she said, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Rain dripped from her hair onto his cold skin. I need you to stay right here and be brave. For me, for Shadow. Okay. His lips trembled, his eyes wide and glassy with tears, but he nodded. She turned and ran toward Shadow, the water rising past her shins as she stumbled through the flooded ditch. The current pulled at her legs, threatening to knock her off balance. She fell once, her knees slamming hard against submerged gravel. Pain exploded up her thigh, but she didn't stop. She scrambled back to her feet and kept going. Shadow turned to her as she reached him, his milky eyes wide with terror, but locked onto her face with unwavering focus. He barked again and reared up on his hind legs, slashing at the coupler, then dropping down to bark into the floodwater. Olivia dropped to her knees beside him. The cold water soaked through her jeans, numbing her legs instantly. She could barely see through the sheets of rain. The little girl sobbed softly, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. Her tiny body trembled with exhaustion and fear. It's okay, baby, Olivia shouted over the wind and rain. It's okay, I'm here. I'm going to get you out. The girl looked up, her eyes wide and terrified tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. Her lips moved soundlessly, her voice too faint to hear. Shadow barked again, spinning in tight circles, before lunging forward to press his nose against the girl's cheek. She flinched at his cold, wet touch, but her tiny hand reached out and fisted in the matted fur on his neck. The train whistle blared again, long and mournful, echoing across the flooded tracks. Olivia's head snapped up. In the distance beyond the stopped train, she saw a set of headlights cutting through the rain. Another train, moving fast, on the same track. The blocked crossing meant it wouldn't see the obstruction until it was too late. God, she whispered, panic flooding her chest. God, please. She reached forward, plunging her hands into the icy water, feeling along the girl's legs for whatever held her trapped. Her fingers closed around a piece of twisted rebar, wedged against the rail, pinning the girl's foot beneath it. It's okay, baby, she panted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It's okay, I've got you. I've got you. Shadow barked again, rearing up to place his front paw on Olivia's shoulder, his claws digging into her soaked shirt. His body trembled violently, his breathing coming in ragged wheezes, but his eyes never left the little girl's face. Good boy. Olivia gasped, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. Good boy, Shadow. Stay with me. She wrapped both hands around the rebar and pulled. The metal didn't budge. Her arms burned with effort, muscles trembling with exhaustion. The girl let out a weak sob, her tiny fingers gripping Olivia's wrist so hard it hurt. Come on, Olivia sobbed, yanking harder. Come on, damn it, move! Shadow threw his head back and howled. The sound rose above the rain, above the thunder, above the approaching roar of the second train. It was a sound that tore through the storm, like a blade vibrating through Olivia's bones and filling her with a desperate surge of strength. She screamed and pulled again, every muscle in her arms and back straining with effort. The rebar shifted a fraction of an inch. The girl let out a sharp cry as her foot twisted, but Olivia didn't stop. She shifted her grip, planted her feet against the submerged rail, and pulled with everything she had left. With a loud metallic screech, the rebar came free. The girl's foot slipped out from under it, and she collapsed forward into Olivia's arms, sobbing hysterically. "I've got you," Olivia gasped, clutching her against her chest. "I've got you, baby. You're okay. You're okay." Shadow barked wildly, spinning in tight circles before pressing his nose against the girl's cheek again. His tail thumped once, twice, before dropping limp again. He pressed his head against Olivia's shoulder, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The approaching train whistle blared again, deafening now, its headlights blazing through the sheets of rain. "Move!" Olivia screamed, clutching the girl to her chest. She scrambled to her feet, slipping and sliding on the submerged tracks. Shadow limped beside her, his head lowered, his ears pinned back against his skull. The ground vibrated beneath their feet as the train thundered toward them, horns screaming into the storm. "Run!" Shadow Lucas's voice shrieked from behind them. "Run!" Olivia stumbled up the embankment, the girl's small body clinging to her neck like a terrified koala. Shadow struggled behind her, his stump dragging through the water, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. She reached the edge of the ditch and turned just as the second train roared past its horn, blaring so loud it rattled her teeth. Wind and rain blasted against them, knocking her backward onto the muddy grass. Shadow collapsed beside her, his sides heaving, foam dripping from his jaws as he panted. For a moment the world was nothing but noise and movement and cold. Then the train was gone. The storm quieted into a steady downpour, and the only sound left was Olivia's ragged sobs and the little girl's quiet crying against her neck. Shadow lifted his head and pressed his nose against the girl's cheek again. His tail thumped weakly in the mud. "You did it," Olivia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved her. You did it, Shadow." Lucas ran to them, slipping and sliding in the mud before dropping to his knees beside Shadow. He threw his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the wet fur. "You're okay," he sobbed. "You're okay, my brave Shadow. My brave, brave Shadow." The little girl clung to Olivia, her tiny body trembling with cold and shock. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder as emergency vehicles raced toward the crossing. Shadow collapsed onto his side, his breathing ragged and uneven, but his eyes stayed locked on Lucas's face. His tail twitched once in the mud before falling still. "You're my hero," Lucas whispered, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "You're my hero, Shadow." And as the rain fell and sirens wailed and the world slowly began to move again, Olivia held the sobbing girl tight against her chest and pressed her face into Shadow's soaked fur, her tears mixing with the rain. Because in that moment, there was nothing left but love. The world had narrowed to a tunnel of rain screams and the pounding of Olivia's own terrified heart. Her knees burned as she crawled through the mud under the stopped train, her soaked jeans clinging to her skin, dragging her down like anchors. Shadow's barking cut through the storm, sharp and insistent, guiding her toward the tiny figure wedged beneath the steel coupler. The dog's three-legged frame moved with frantic determination, his body slamming against the wet ground as he clawed forward, unwilling to let the floodwaters steal this life. "Hang on, baby," Olivia gasped, her breath ragged. "Hang on, I'm here. I'm coming." The little girl's sobs rose weakly above the roar of the rain, each cry punctuated by shuddering gasps as water lapped against her pink raincoat. Her small hands clutched the slick rail, trying to pull herself free from where her boot was pinned under twisted debris. Shadow reached her first. He pressed his nose against her cheek, whining deep in his chest, his tail whipping mud into the air. The girl flinched at his touch. Her wide eyes glazed with terror, but her trembling fingers reached out and tangled in the wet fur on his neck. "Good boy." Olivia choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Good boy, Shadow. Stay with her. Don't let her go." She crawled forward until her hands closed around the girl's tiny shoulders. The child sobbed harder, her entire body shaking with cold and fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Olivia whispered, her voice shaking as thunder cracked overhead. "It's okay. I've got you. I've got you." Shadow barked again, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, but still strong enough to pierce the raging storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating his soaked black fur, turning him into a dark specter against the screaming sky. Behind them, the wail of sirens rose, weaving through the wind and rain. Red and blue lights flickered on the wet asphalt of the crossing, reflecting in the rushing water that pooled around Olivia's knees. Over here, she screamed, her voice raw. We need help over here, Shadow barked again, spinning in tight circles before pressing his head against the girl's chest, his nose bumping her chin in reassurance. His tail twitched weakly behind him, slapping against the wet metal rail. 2 police officers splashed through the flooded ditch, their boots sending up sprays of dirty water. Their flashlights cut bright beams through the darkness, illuminating the scene in stark, trembling light. Ma'am, don't move, one of them shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. His gloved hands reached out, feeling along the girl's trapped leg. She's pinned under something. You need to lift it. Help her, Olivia sobbed, clutching the child's trembling shoulders. Please help her. Shadow barked again, loud and sharp, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The second officer moved to his side, eyes narrowing as he realized what the dog was doing. He's guiding us, the officer said, voice tight with awe. He's telling us where she's trapped. Good boy, Olivia whispered, tears streaming down her rain-slicked cheeks. Good boy, Shadow. Show them. Show them. Shadow backed up a step, turned and pressed his nose against the twisted rebar pinning the girl's boot. He pawed at it frantically, his claws scraping sparks off the rusted metal. The officer followed his movement, his flashlight beam landing on the debris. Here he shouted to his partner, Help me lift this. Both men braced themselves against the steel rail, their boots slipping in the mud as they strained against the rebar. Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the ground beneath them. Rain poured off the brim of their hats, soaking their uniforms and streaming down their backs. On 3, the first officer grunted. 1, 2, 3. They heaved together, muscles straining with effort. The rebar shifted slightly, scraping against the rail with a metallic shriek. The girl screamed as her foot twisted, but Shadow barked sharply, pressing his head against her chest, his tail thumping once against the mud, as if to say, Hold on. Hold on, little one. Again, Olivia gasped, her arms wrapped tight around the child's shaking body. Please again. The officers repositioned their grips, their faces twisted with effort. Lightning split the sky, illuminating their straining muscles, the trembling child, and Shadow's soaked, trembling frame. 1, 2, 3. With a final wrenching scream of metal, the rebar lifted. Olivia yanked the girl's boot free, pulling her into her arms as she collapsed backward into the mud. The child sobbed against her chest, her small fingers digging into Olivia's shirt with desperate strength. It's okay, Olivia gasped, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. You're okay. I've got you. You're okay. Shadow barked again, weak and hoarse, then collapsed onto his side in the mud, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. His eyes rolled back for a moment before fluttering open, locking onto Lucas's small figure standing on the embankment, sobbing into his hands. Mommy, Lucas screamed, his voice cracking. Is she okay? Is Shadow okay? She's okay, Olivia shouted back, her voice breaking. She's okay. Baby, Shadow saved her. The girl's mother arrived, seconds later, stumbling through the mud, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes wide with terror. She fell to her knees beside Olivia, her hands trembling as she reached for her daughter. Lila, she sobbed, her voice breaking with relief and anguish. Oh, God. Lila, baby, are you okay? The little girl turned in Olivia's arms, reaching out with a sob. Mommy. Her mother pulled her close, crushing her against her chest as she rocked back and forth in the mud, tears streaming down her rain-streaked cheeks. My baby, she sobbed. My baby, my baby, my baby. Shadow let out a quiet whine, his head lifting slightly before dropping back into the mud. His breathing was shallow, his thin ribs rising and falling with ragged effort. Lucas stumbled down the embankment, falling to his knees beside him. Shadow, he sobbed, pressing his forehead against the dog's. Please don't die. Please don't die. You're my hero. You're my Shadow. Shadow's ears twitched at his voice. His tail thumped once weakly against the wet ground. The paramedics arrived, splashing through the floodwater with their equipment bags slung over their shoulders. They surrounded the mother and child, their voices calm and practiced as they checked Lila's pulse, her oxygen levels, her responsiveness. The girl sobbed quietly against her mother's chest, her small body shaking with cold and shock. She's okay, one of the medics said, his voice tight with relief. She's in shock, but she's okay. The girl's mother let out a broken sob, her entire body collapsing forward as she cradled her daughter against her chest. Kontoy, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Kontoy Sungroy, my baby's alive. Shadow let out a quiet sigh, his eyes fluttering closed as his chest rose and fell with shallow, exhausted breaths. Lucas clung to his neck, his small fingers tangled in the dog's soaked fur. You saved her, he whispered, tears dripping from his chin onto Shadow's face. You saved her, Shadow. You're a hero. My hero. The rain continued to fall cold and relentless, washing the blood and mud from Olivia's hands as she knelt beside her son and the dog who had saved a life. The flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles painted the world in shifting colors. Danger, relief, grief, and hope, all woven into the flickering shadows. One of the officers knelt beside them, his flashlight beam steady on Shadow's trembling frame. "Is this your dog, ma'am?" Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her face as she stroked Shadow's head. "Yes," she whispered. "This is Shadow. This is our Shadow." The officer reached out and gently rested his hand on Shadow's side, feeling the weak thump of his heart beneath his fingers. His eyes softened, and he nodded once. "He's a hero," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. "He saved her life." Shadow let out a quiet huff, his milky eyes fluttering open to lock onto Olivia's tear-streaked face. For a moment the storm seemed to fade, the rain quieting into a soft patter against the soaked earth. In that brief silence, Olivia saw James's smile in Shadow's weary eyes. She felt his warmth in the dog's trembling chest. She bent forward and pressed her forehead against Shadow's, her tears mingling with the rain on his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with grief and gratitude. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." Shadow's tail thumped once more against the mud, a quiet echo of hope in the dark. And in that moment, with the world around them flashing in red and blue, with the rain falling in endless sheets, with the sobs of a reunited mother and daughter echoing through the storm, Olivia knew something with absolute certainty. This broken dog, blind, battered, unwanted, had become their light. Their Shadow had saved them all. The world woke up to rain the next morning, soft and relentless, drumming against rooftops and flowing down gutter drains in thin silver streams. But for the Winters household, there was no sound but quiet breathing. Lucas lay curled on the living room rug, his small arm draped protectively over Shadow's ribcage. The dog's breathing was ragged but steady, each shallow rise of his chest a fragile victory. Olivia sat slumped in the old rocking chair by the window, her hair damp and tangled, her clothes still streaked with dried mud. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the train's headlights blazing through the storm, felt the thunder of its approach vibrating through her bones, heard the scream of twisted metal as she pulled the little girl free. She looked at Shadow lying beside her son, his black fur still crusted with mud and rain. He lay on his side, his milky eyes half closed, his ribs rising and falling with quiet, exhausted breaths. A patch of fur on his back had been shaved to treat the abrasions where the train coupler had scraped him as he crawled under to reach the girl. The vet had said he'd recover, but he needed rest, antibiotics, and careful wound care. Outside, the world was waking up. She could hear cars splashing through puddles along Maple Street, muffled voices calling good morning to neighbors. And then came the sound that made her heart clench, a knock on the front door, rapid, impatient. Then another. Lucas stirred, blinking blearily as he sat up, his hair a tangled halo around his pale face. Shadow whined softly, lifting his head a few inches before letting it drop again with a quiet thud. "Mommy," Lucas whispered, rubbing his eyes. "Who is it?" Olivia stood, her knees popping painfully as she crossed the room. She pulled open the door, and a rush of cool morning air swept through the living room, carrying with it the smell of wet grass and pavement. On her porch stood a young woman in a slick blue raincoat, a fuzzy microphone clutched in her gloved hands. Behind her, a cameraman in a bright yellow poncho hoisted a large broadcast camera onto his shoulder, adjusting the lens with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Winters, the reporter, asked, her voice high and eager. "Kathy Stroud, Channel 8 News. We were hoping to get a statement about what happened last night." Last night, Olivia echoed, her mind still foggy from exhaustion and adrenaline. The reporter smiled, her teeth bright against her pale pink lipstick. "Your dog, Shadow Wright, the blind three-legged lab who saved that little girl from under the train. It's everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, the morning news. Hero dog saves child from flooded tracks. That's what they're calling him." Olivia blinked, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door. I don't... "Mommy, what's happening?" Lucas asked, padding over in his pajamas, his eyes still puffy with sleep. The cameraman swung the lens toward him, and the red record light blinked on. "There he is," the reporter cooed. "The boy who adopted Shadow. Can we talk to him on camera? Just a few words about what his dog did last night." Olivia opened her mouth to refuse, but before she could, Shadow whined from the rug, his tail thumping weakly against the floorboards. The reporter's eyes lit up. "Is that him?" she gasped, stepping forward to peer over Olivia's shoulder. "Oh my God, he's beautiful." Lucas turned back to Shadow and dropped to his knees beside him. He buried his face in the dog's neck, his small body trembling with quiet sobs. "Bagui Maiden," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears slid down his cheeks. "My comfy Shadow. My la light." The cameraman zoomed in, capturing the child's whispered confession to his hero. The red record light flickered brighter, blinking like a heartbeat in the dim morning living room. Olivia felt her throat tighten, tears burning hot behind her eyes. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. The reporter stepped back, her face softening as she watched mother, son, and dog curled together on the floor. "That's beautiful," she whispered to her cameraman. "Get everything. Wide shots, close-ups. This is going to run all day." Within an hour, there were 3 more news vans parked outside their small house on Maple Street. Neighbors gathered on their porches in bathrobes and slippers, watching as reporters jostled each other for position on the muddy front lawn. Camera flashes strobed against the rain, illuminating the crushed hydrangeas and the broken porch railing where shadow had burst through the night before. Hero dog saves toddler from certain death. Blind 3-legged Labrador guides. Mother to rescue. Miracle in Maple Street flood. Headlines scrolled across every television screen in the county. The footage of Lucas crying into Shadow's neck played on repeat, spliced between interviews with the police officers who had helped lift the debris, and shaky cell phone footage from a neighbor showing Olivia sprinting down the flooded ditch, lightning blazing overhead. By noon, their phone rang non-stop. Animal rescue groups, churches, local charities. One offered to pay Shadow's medical bills in full. Another wanted to feature him on their annual calendar. A dog food company emailed an offer of a lifetime supply if they could film a commercial of Shadow with Lucas. But through it all, Olivia barely noticed. She sat curled in the rocking chair, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the 2 figures asleep on the rug. Lucas had cried himself into exhaustion. His small chest rose and fell with soft, even breaths. His fingers remained tangled in Shadow's damp fur, as if he feared letting go might make the dog disappear. Shadow slept deeply, his body twitching occasionally as he dreamed. His breathing remained ragged but steady, each wheezing inhale and trembling exhale, a stubborn refusal to surrender. His stump was wrapped in clean gauze now, a bright white contrast against his matted black fur. The vet had come early, pushing past the camera crews with quiet efficiency to check his wounds and administer an antibiotic injection. She left a bottle of pills on the kitchen table, with careful instructions scrawled on the label in black marker. Finish all meds. Keep him warm and hydrated. Call immediately if breathing worsens. At 3 p.m. Channel 8 aired a special segment. Kathy Stroud stood in front of their little blue house, the maple tree behind her dripping rain onto her bright pink umbrella. "Local boy. Lucas Winters adopted Shadow from the county shelter just last week," she said, smiling into the camera. Despite being blind and missing a leg, Shadow has proven that true vision comes from the heart. The footage cut to Lucas's tear-streaked face as he whispered into Shadow's ear. "Bagui may den. May comfy Shadow. May la light." Beneath the image, bold white letters scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Light in the darkness. Hero dog saves girl." The phones rang even louder after that. Olivia ignored them. She brewed a pot of tea she didn't drink, poured a bowl of cereal she didn't eat. She sat on the edge of the rug, her fingers carding gently through Shadow's dirty fur as she watched her son sleep. Outside, the rain eased into a quiet drizzle. Sunlight broke through the clouds in thin golden shafts, illuminating the drenched street in liquid light. The news vans left one by one, engines rumbling as they pulled away from the curb, leaving behind deep tire ruts in the muddy grass. That evening, as twilight fell soft and blue across Maple Street, Olivia sat on the porch steps with Shadow curled at her feet. Lucas lay with his head resting against the dog's flank, his fingers tracing slow, careful circles across the matted fur. "Mommy," he said softly, his voice dreamy with exhaustion. "Did you hear me this morning?" "Hear you say what, baby?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "When I told Shadow he's not Shadow, he's light." She smiled, her chest tightening with love, so fierce it felt like pain. "I heard you," she whispered, "and you're right." Lucas blinked slowly, his eyelids drooping with sleep. "Ba sent him, didn't he? To help us not be so sad." Olivia's throat closed. She looked out at the quiet street, the damp pavement glowing gold in the last light of day. The neighbor's wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze, its hollow notes echoing against the porch railing. "I think," she said, her voice trembling with the truth of it, "that your daddy loved us so much he couldn't leave us alone in the dark." Shadow shifted beside her, his head lifting weakly to press his nose against her thigh. His tail thumped once against the porch step, then fell still. Lucas closed his eyes, his breathing deepening into the slow rhythm of sleep. Olivia curled her arm around his narrow shoulders and pressed her lips to the crown of his head. And for the first time since the accident, she let herself believe they might be okay. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But someday. Because in the space where grief once lived, Something new was blooming. Something fragile and bright and stubborn. Hope. She looked down at Shadow at his tired eyes and trembling chest and saw it there too. Light. Their light. The quiet glow of their newfound hope lasted only a few days before it began to crumble under the weight of jealousy, suspicion, and something far darker. It started on a Wednesday night when the air was heavy with humidity and moths battered themselves against the porch light. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, sifting through medical bills and half-finished homework assignments, listening to the rhythmic tick of the old clock on the wall. Outside, Shadow lay curled on the porch beside Lucas, who was reading aloud to him from his dog encyclopedia, his small voice soft and earnest. Labradors have a really good sense of smell, Lucas read, running his finger along the words. They can track people who are lost or find drugs or even smell cancer. Shadow's tail thumped once in the darkness, his milky eyes turned toward Lucas with an unseeing gaze that nonetheless seemed to glow with gentle attention. But then across the street porch lights snapped on. A door banged open. Voices drifted across the lawn like poison carried on the breeze. Sick of that damn dog barking all night? A freak animal. Should have been put down. Gonna call animal control tomorrow if it doesn't shut up. Olivia's hand froze on the page she was reading. Her heart stuttered painfully. She stood and walked to the screen door, her eyes searching the shadows across the street. Mr. Harlan stood on his porch in a stained white tank top. His heavy arms crossed over his chest, his chin lifted defiantly. "Hey, Winters," he shouted, his voice slurred with late-night whiskey. "Control your mutt or I will." "Leave her alone," his wife hissed from behind him, tugging at his arm. "They just saved that little girl. Don't start trouble." But he ignored her, his bloodshot eyes locked on Olivia. "I don't care what that piece of trash dog did. It barks at shadows all night, wakes up the baby. If animal control won't take it, I'll put a bullet in it myself." Olivia felt her hands curl into fists. Heat rose up her chest into her throat. Before she could respond, Lucas's small voice broke the tension. "Shadow doesn't bark at nothing," he said, his words trembling with fear and anger. "He's just scared." "Then keep him inside," Mr. Harlan shouted back, spittle flying from his lips. "Or you're going to be digging a grave in that yard by Sunday." Olivia stepped forward, her voice low and cold. "If you ever threaten my son's dog again, I'll have the police here so fast you won't remember your own name." Mr. Harlan glared at her, his chest heaving before turning and stomping back into his house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the porch windows across the street. Lucas pressed his face into Shadow's neck, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Shadow let out a quiet whine, nosing at Lucas's cheek, his tail sweeping the porch boards in slow, comforting thuds. "Shh," Olivia whispered, sinking to her knees beside them and wrapping her arms around both dog and boy. "It's okay, baby. He's just angry at the world. It's not your fault." But that night, after she tucked Lucas into bed and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to Shadow's soft panting from the rug, a chill wormed its way down her spine. Because beneath Mr. Harlan's drunken threats, she heard something darker. The bitterness of a man who believed the world owed him something, and who might take it from anyone he could. The next morning dawned hot and bright, the humidity pressing against the windows like an unwanted hand. Olivia tried to keep the day normal. She packed Lucas's lunch, kissed his forehead, and sent him off to school with Shadow watching from the porch, his ears perked at the sound of the school bus engine. But shortly after noon, as she stood rinsing dishes in the kitchen sink, a knock came at the door. A quiet, precise knock. 3 evenly spaced raps that sent a tremor of unease down her arms. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door. A man stood on the porch, dressed in a charcoal gray suit despite the heat. His hair was perfectly combed back, steel gray at the temples. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, sharp as winter ice. He held a black leather folder in his left hand, the initials R.D., embossed in silver on the cover. "Mrs. Winters?" he asked, his voice deep and calm, though entirely devoid of warmth. "Yes," Olivia said cautiously. "Can I help you?" He didn't smile. Instead, his gaze flicked past her to Shadow, who lay beside the porch railing, his chin resting on his front paw, ears twitching at the sound of the stranger's voice. "That's him," the man said softly, almost to himself. "That's Shadow." Olivia stepped forward, placing herself between the man and the dog. "Who are you?" He looked up at her, those cold blue eyes flicking over her face with detached assessment. "My name is Richard Dane. I believe you have my dog." "I'm sorry," Olivia said, her stomach knotting painfully. "Your dog." He opened the black folder and pulled out a glossy photograph. It showed Shadow younger, healthier, his coat sleek and shiny, his eyes clear and dark, standing beside a teenage boy in a hospital bed. The boy was bald, thin as a skeleton beneath his blue hospital gown, but his smile was radiant as he wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. "This was my son Nathan," the man said, his voice tightening for the first time, though his expression remained flat and cold. He had leukemia. Stage 4. Shadow was his therapy dog. Olivia swallowed hard, her throat dry as paper. She glanced down at Shadow, who had lifted his head and was staring into the distance, his milky eyes unfocused, but his ears pricked at the sound of his old name. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she whispered. The man nodded once, a curt, mechanical movement. "Nathan passed away 3 months ago. Shadow was... he was all he had those last months. He slept in Nathan's bed every night, listened when he was too weak to talk to anyone else. He was part of my son, part of his hope." Olivia felt tears sting her eyes. How did Shadow end up at the shelter? The man's jaw tightened, a flicker of something. Guilt, pain, shame, passing through his icy gaze. "After Nathan died, I couldn't look at him. Every time I saw that dog, I saw my son dying all over again." He took a deep breath, his shoulders lifting with effort before falling again. "I sent him away. But I shouldn't have. I realize that now. I've been empty since Nathan passed. But seeing Shadow on the news this morning, hearing what he did for that little girl, it was like seeing my boy alive again." His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Olivia saw a tremor of desperation beneath the ice. "I want him back. I need him back. He's all I have left. He's all." Olivia's chest constricted so tight she could barely breathe. She looked down at Shadow. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his ears flicking at the man's voice, his tail twitching weakly against the porch boards. Lucas's words from that morning echoed in her mind. "Bagui mai den. May home fi Shadow. May la light." "He's not just your memory anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He saved my son. He saved that little girl. He's part of our family now." The man's expression hardened instantly. Whatever flicker of grief or humanity she had seen vanished like smoke in the wind. "That dog is registered under my name," he said, his voice flat and cold once more. "Microchipped. Licensed. Legally, he's my property. I can have the police here within the hour." Olivia felt her knees tremble. Rage burned up her chest, hot and suffocating, mingling with fear until it tasted like acid on her tongue. "He's not an object?" she said, her voice shaking, but strong. "He's not yours to own." The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Everything is owned by someone, Mrs. Winters. You'll hear from my attorney." He turned and walked down the steps. His leather shoes silent on the wet grass, his suit immaculate despite the humid drizzle that had begun to fall from the steel-gray sky. Shadow let out a quiet whine, his ears flattening against his skull as he laid his head back down on his paw. Olivia sank to her knees beside him, burying her fingers in his damp fur, her tears falling silently onto his back. "He can't take you," she whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed her forehead to his side. "I won't let him take you. You're ours now. You're light." Inside the house, the phone rang. Then again. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the porch roof like the quickening beat of a terrified heart. And in that moment, kneeling beside her son's last hope and the dog who had become their light, Olivia realized this fight was only beginning. Night came heavy and silent to Maple Street, pressing against the windows with the weight of unanswered prayers. The house was dark except for a single lamp glowing in the living room, casting long shadows across the worn rug and flickering against Olivia's pale face. She sat hunched in the rocking chair, elbows braced on her knees, her fingers tangled in her hair as she stared at the sleeping form curled at her feet. Shadow, light, lay on his side, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. The fresh bandages around his leg glowed white against his black fur. Each inhale was a victory. Each exhale sounded like goodbye. The words of Richard Dane echoed in her head, cold and precise as the steel-gray suit he wore. "That dog is registered under my name, microchipped, licensed. Legally, he's my property. I can have the police here within the hour. Property, property." She pressed her knuckles against her lips to stifle the sob rising in her chest. He wasn't a lamp. He wasn't a car. He wasn't a dusty box of photographs kept locked away to preserve a memory. He was alive. He was the beat of her son's tiny heart when Lucas buried his face in Shadow's fur to stop his nightmares. He was the hope in her boy's eyes when he whispered, "Bagui mai den? May home fi Shadow. May la light." But Richard's haunted eyes haunted her too. The way his voice trembled when he said Shadow was the last piece of his dead son, that he had banished him out of grief, out of despair. that he wanted him back to feel close to the boy he'd buried under polished marble and lilies no amount of water could keep alive. What right did she have to deny him that? What right did he have to take Light away from Lucas? Her chest ached with the weight of both truths. 2 mothers, 2 sons. 1 dog trapped between the love of the living and the memory of the dead. Shadow whimpered in his sleep, his legs twitching as if chasing something in a dream. Olivia reached down and stroked his ears, feeling the soft warmth of him beneath her trembling hand. Tears blurred her vision until he was just a black shadow in a world of gray and gold. "Mommy," she turned. Lucas stood in the doorway, his pajamas' twisted hair tousled, his eyes bleary with sleep. But beneath the fog of dreams was something clear and ancient, something that reminded her so painfully of James that her chest seized. She wiped her tears quickly, forcing her voice to steady. "Baby, what are you doing up?" He patted across the room, his small feet silent on the cold wood floor. He knelt beside Shadow, resting his cheek gently on the dog's flank, feeling the slow rise and fall beneath his skin. "I heard you crying," he whispered. Olivia swallowed the sob that rose again, tasting salt and grief and fear on her tongue. "I'm okay," she lied. Lucas didn't move, didn't speak. Just sat in silence, his fingers carding softly through Light's matted fur. After a long moment, he spoke. "Is he going away?" Olivia's breath hitched. Her vision blurred again. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. Lucas lifted his head. His blue eyes met hers. James's eyes, only smaller, unbroken, still filled with childish trust. "Mio," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Light doesn't belong to anyone. He belongs to whoever needs him most." The words pierced her like a blade of light through the darkness, splitting apart every selfish prayer she had whispered in the dead of night. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, unchecked. Who needed him more? The grieving father who had thrown Light away because he couldn't bear to see his dead son's ghost in those trusting eyes? Or the living boy who saw his father's love every time? Light pressed his nose against his hand. Lucas crawled into her lap, curling his thin arms around her neck. His cheek was wet with tears, his hair damp with sweat and sleep. He smelled like apples and rain. "I love him so much, Mommy," he whispered. "But if he can make other people not feel sad anymore, I think that's what Ba would want." Her chest cracked open then, wide and raw and aching. Because Lucas wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of James. Of the father he had lost and the light he had gained in this broken dog with blind eyes and trembling legs. She pressed her face into his hair, sobbing silently into the curls that smelled like the shampoo she had bought last week. Light shifted beside them, letting out a soft whine as his tail thumped once against the rug. The room was silent, except for the whisper of Lucas's breath and the ragged rhythm of Light's lungs. Olivia's tears soaked into her son's hair, each one falling like a blessing, like a prayer, like a confession. "I don't want to lose him." But in her heart, a voice whispered back, "He was never yours to lose." She pulled back and cupped Lucas's face in her shaking hands, brushing her thumbs across the tear tracks on his soft cheeks. "You're a good boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're such a good boy, Lucas." His lips wobbled as he blinked up at her. "What are we going to do, Mommy?" She looked down at Light, at his half-closed eyes and his scarred muzzle, at the tremble in his shoulders as he breathed. And in that moment, she realized that no matter what choice she made, someone would lose. But only one choice honored what Light truly was. Not an object, not a memory, not property. A healer. Light. She pressed her forehead against Lucas's and closed her eyes. "We're going to do what Ba would do," she whispered. "Help people." Lucas finished, his voice breaking. She nodded, her tears falling onto his cheeks. "Help people." Outside, the night wind rustled the maple tree, rattling the window panes with a quiet sigh. The house was silent, wrapped in the fragile stillness that comes after a storm, but before the dawn. And in that silence, Olivia felt something shift inside her. The breaking of chains she hadn't known were still wrapped around her heart. Because James was gone, but Light remained. Not as a replacement, not as a burden, but as the quiet truth their broken family had almost forgotten. That love doesn't belong to anyone. It simply is. The next morning, the sun rose behind a thick veil of gray clouds. Olivia stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into her favorite chipped mug, the one James had given her on their first anniversary. The words, "You are my sunrise," were faded now, nearly invisible, but she could still feel them against her lips as she drank. Lucas sat at the table, still in his pajamas, feeding Light small pieces of scrambled eggs from his plate. The dog chewed each bite carefully, his tail sweeping the floor in slow, contented arcs. "Mommy," Lucas said suddenly, his voice quiet but certain. "If Light goes back to that man, will he be happy?" Olivia stared into her coffee, the steam curling against her cheek like a gentle touch. "I don't know," she whispered. "I really don't know." Lucas nodded thoughtfully, scratching behind Light's ears. Maybe he needs him more than we do. The words punched through her chest with terrible, beautiful force. She set her coffee down, her hands trembling as she crossed the kitchen to kneel beside him. "But I need you," she whispered fiercely, cupping his face in her palms. "You're my Light, Lucas. No matter what happens." He smiled then. Small, brave, beautiful. And wrapped his arms around her neck. Light pressed his nose against her thigh, whining softly, his tail wagging against Lucas's leg. The three of them sat like that for a long moment, wrapped in a silence that felt like forgiveness, like absolution, like the first breath after nearly drowning. Outside, the wind stirred the maple leaves into a soft, whispering song. And in Olivia's chest, something long frozen finally began to melt. The day Olivia made her decision, the sky was the color of old tin, low and heavy with unshed rain. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of cold coffee she hadn't touched. Across from her, Lucas built towers from his cereal pieces, humming softly under his breath, unaware that his world was on the verge of fracture. Shadow lay at their feet, his tail flicking slowly against the linoleum. His blind eyes turned toward the window, as if he could see the morning light seeping through the curtains. Olivia's phone buzzed on the table. The lawyer's name flashed across the screen in bright white letters. Richard Dane. Follow up. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached down and ran her hand along Shadow's back, feeling the scars beneath his fur, the tremble of his muscles as he breathed. He was theirs. And yet, he was no one's. Not hers, not Richard's. He was Light. He belonged to the world, to whoever needed him most. "Mommy?" Lucas asked, his voice quiet, his eyes wide with worry. "What are you going to do?" She looked at him and saw James's eyes. James's courage. James's gentle, unbreakable love. "I'm going to do what Ba would do," she whispered. That afternoon, she called the news station. Then the local hospital. Then the city council. She sat on hold for hours, her phone battery draining her fingers numb with tension. But every time doubt crept in, she looked at Shadow. Light. Sleeping in the sunbeam on the living room rug, and she pressed forward. By sunset, her plan was in motion. The next morning, Richard arrived in a sleek black car, the tires crunching across the gravel driveway with a sound like breaking bones. He stepped out, his suit perfectly pressed, his hair slicked back, his cold blue eyes scanning the yard before settling on Olivia, standing on the porch with Shadow at her feet. "Mrs. Winters," he said coolly, adjusting his cufflinks. "I trust you've come to a decision." She nodded, once her heart thundering in her chest. "I have." He waited silent, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not giving him back to you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Because he's not an object to be owned. He's Light, and he belongs with those who need him most." Richard's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered in his cheek. "You realize I have legal grounds?" She cut him off. "You had him, and you threw him away when he needed you. Now he's going to help children who need him." He frowned, confusion flickering across his sharp features. "What are you talking about?" Olivia drew in a shaky breath and lifted her chin. "I've partnered with St. Mary's Children's Hospital. We're starting a program called Light's Hope Foundation. Shadow will train as a therapy dog for pediatric cancer patients. He'll visit kids who are scared and in pain and alone, just like your son was." Richard flinched as if slapped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes dropped to the dog at her feet. Shadow tilted his head, ears flicking at the man's voice tail, sweeping once across the porch boards. "He's going to give them hope," Olivia continued, her voice breaking. "Hope that life isn't just pain. Hope that there's something beautiful waiting for them beyond the chemo and the surgeries and the dark." Silence fell between them, heavy as stone. Richard swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as he turned his gaze away, out toward the street lined with gold-leafed maples, trembling in the autumn breeze. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "Nathan. He used to say that Shadow was his light. That when everything hurt too much, Shadow's warmth reminded him there was still good in the world." Olivia felt tears slip down her cheeks, hot and silent. Then let him keep being that. For other children. Richard closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened them again, they were no longer cold and empty, but raw with grief and something softer. "Promise me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Promise me he'll be loved." "He already is," Olivia said, her voice trembling. Slowly he nodded. Then he turned and walked back to his car. As he pulled away, Shadow lifted his head and let out a quiet, mournful bark, as if saying goodbye to the ghost of the boy he once loved. A week later, Shadow walked through the halls of St. Mary's Children's Hospital for the first time. His harness was blue with his name embroidered in bright gold letters, Light's Hope. Lucas walked beside him, his small hand resting on Shadow's back to guide him. Nurses and doctors paused as they passed their eyes wide with wonder at the blind three-legged dog walking confidently down the hallway, his tail wagging softly, his ears flicking at every whispered greeting. They stopped outside room 12B. Inside, a boy of 8 lay curled beneath a thin blanket, his scalp shiny under the fluorescent lights, his skin pale and waxen. His mother sat beside him, her eyes hollow with sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. Lucas knocked gently on the doorframe. "Hi," he said shyly. "Can we come in?" The boy didn't respond. His eyes stared blankly at the TV mounted on the wall, where muted cartoons flickered in an endless loop. The mother nodded, wiping her tears quickly as she forced a smile. "Of course." Lucas led Shadow to the bed. The dog paused, sniffing the sterile air, then placed his front paw carefully on the mattress. He leaned forward and let out a low, quiet sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine, almost like a song. The boy blinked. Slowly, his gaze shifted from the TV to the black dog standing beside him. Shadow's blind eyes stared off into the distance, but his ears flicked forward, and he let out another soft, musical woof. A smile tugged at the boy's cracked lips. His eyes glistened with tears. "Doggy?" He whispered, his voice ragged with chemo burns and exhaustion. Shadow let out a third quiet woof, his tail thumping against the bed frame like a gentle drumbeat. Lucas reached out and took the boy's hand, placing it on Shadow's head. "He's light," Lucas said softly. "He's here for you." The boy's fingers curled into the dog's fur. His shoulders trembled with silent sobs, but his eyes glowed with something brighter than pain. Hope. Down the hall, Olivia watched from the doorway, her hand pressed over her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched her son stroke Shadow's back, watched the boy in the bed cling to the dog as if he were a lifeline thrown across a storming sea. A nurse stepped up beside her, her eyes red with tears. "That's beautiful," she whispered. Olivia nodded, unable to speak, because in that moment she felt James beside her, his warmth, his smile, his quiet strength. She felt his hand on her back, his breath against her ear as he whispered, "This is why we're here. To love, to heal, to bring light into the dark." She pressed her fingers against her lips, sobbing silently as she watched Shadow rest his head beside the boy's, watched Lucas whisper something that made the boy laugh. A sound so fragile and beautiful, it cracked open the hearts of everyone in the room. Outside the hospital windows, the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the sterile hallways with gold. And in that golden light stood a blind, broken dog with 3 legs and a heart big enough to carry the world. He wasn't Shadow anymore. He was light, and he belonged to everyone who needed him. Night fell quietly over Maple Street, wrapping the little neighborhood in a blanket of shadows and cricket songs. The porch light glowed dimly, illuminating peeling paint and flower pots filled with lavender and basil. Inside the house, Olivia moved from room to room, turning off lamps, folding blankets, picking up toys. The exhaustion of a long day weighed heavy in her bones, but tonight it was a peaceful tiredness, the kind that settled into her chest with a whisper of, "We did enough today." In the living room, Lucas lay curled on the rug beside Shadow, his head resting on the dog's rib cage, rising and falling with each deep, even breath. Shadow's blind eyes were closed, his black fur glowing silver in the moonlight streaming through the window. His tail flicked once, twice against the wooden floor, thump, 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 like a heartbeat against the quiet. "Come on, baby," Olivia whispered, brushing a curl away from Lucas's forehead. "Let's get you into bed." Lucas stirred, rubbing his eyes with a small fist. "Can Shadow come too?" She smiled softly, pressing a kiss to his temple. "Of course." Together they walked up the narrow staircase. Lucas's hand clutching Shadow's harness, the dog moving slowly beside him, his nails clicking against the old wood steps. In Lucas's room, the nightlight glowed soft orange, casting gentle shadows across the blue walls, covered in glow-in-the-dark stars. Lucas crawled under his blanket, tucking his stuffed bear beneath his chin. Shadow circled twice before settling onto his bed in the corner, a thick old comforter folded just for him. He let out a long sigh, his tail sweeping the carpet once before going still. Lucas whispered as Olivia tucked the blanket under his chin. Can I watch the stars for a little bit before sleep?" She hesitated. It was already late. But there was something in his voice, a quiet pleading wrapped in a strength far too old for his 7 years. "Okay," she said softly, pushing open the window above his bed. Cool night air drifted in, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of an owl calling from the woods beyond their backyard. Lucas sat up, resting his elbows on the windowsill, his eyes scanning the sky. Shadow shifted on his blanket, lifting his head, his blind eyes turning toward Lucas as if he too was listening for something only children could hear. The sky was a deep, endless black, scattered with stars so bright they looked like shattered diamonds tossed across velvet. The Milky Way arched overhead, a river of light flowing silently through the darkness. Lucas's breath fogged the window glass. He pressed his forehead against the cool pane, searching, hoping, wishing. "Mommy," he whispered without turning. "Do you think Ba can see us right now?" Olivia's throat tightened. She sank onto the edge of his bed, her fingers brushing the hair at the nape of his neck. "I think," she said, her voice trembling. "He sees you every day." Lucas nodded slowly, blinking away tears that caught the starlight. Outside, a breeze rustled the maple trees, sending moonlit leaves dancing across the yard. Then, suddenly, a streak of light cut across the sky. Bright and fast, it burned a path through the darkness, trailing silver and white behind it, like the brushstroke of an unseen artist. "A shooting star." Lucas gasped, his eyes wide with wonder. He pressed his palms together, bowing his head. His lips moved silently for a moment, before he whispered, barely audible, "Baoi, con colaitro, con seon." Shadow let out a quiet woof from his corner, his tail sweeping the carpet once in a slow, comforting rhythm. Olivia felt tears spill down her cheeks, hot and silent, as she watched her son gaze up at the sky, his eyes reflecting a hope so pure it made her chest ache. Outside the window, the shooting star faded into the black, leaving behind only darkness, speckled with tiny lights. But for Lucas, the world felt brighter, as if that star had left a trail of gold in his heart. He turned and crawled back under his blanket, pulling it up to his chin. Shadow rose and patted over his nails, clicking softly on the wood floor. He nudged his nose under Lucas's hand, letting out a soft huff before curling up beside the bed. "Good night, Light." Lucas whispered, his fingers tangled in the dog's fur. Olivia brushed her lips against his forehead. "Good night, my brave boy." She stood and crossed to the window, looking out over the yard, bathed in silver moonlight. In the distance, the woods rustled softly, a chorus of hidden life whispering through the darkness. The stars glittered cold and bright above them, silent witnesses to grief, hope, and every quiet miracle in between. She turned to look at Lucas one last time before turning off the lamp. He was already asleep, his breathing slow, and even his hand still resting on Shadow's head. The dog's ears flicked once, his tail sweeping the floor before settling again. Olivia closed the door gently behind her, pressing her back against it as she let out a shuddering breath. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something warm and healing. Because tonight she knew they would be okay. The camera pulls back from Lucas's sleeping face, from Shadow curled beside him, from the quiet house on Maple Street glowing softly in the moonlight. It rises above the rooftops, above the streetlights and rustling trees into the black velvet sky. The stars glitter endlessly vast and ancient, their cold light reaching across time and space to touch the small sleeping boy and the broken dog who had become his light. As the screen fades to black, a single line appears glowing in quiet golden letters. Light does not come from the brightest places. It comes from hearts that know how to see in the dark. And in the silence that follows, the world feels softer, more forgiving, as if somewhere, somehow, love has found a way to mend what grief had broken.